So I'll be talking about the Black radical tradition today. So really just to start off, kind of unpack what democracy really even means, and it can have a number of different meanings for people. So usually when we talk about democracy, we're referring to official democracy. So it's what we typically have in mind when we learn in school about what's democracy. So you go vote, you pay attention to what the political candidates are up to and what their views are. So real representative government. So we choose the people to represent us to make the decisions in the federal government, local government, state government. But that's not the only type of democracy that there is. The one that's typically talked about much less is this democracy from below. So it's people living democratically in their lives on a day-to-day basis. So not only the particular organizations that people work with on a consistent basis, but just how do they live their lives? Like, do you typically make decisions, just on your own without consulting people? Do you make decisions collaboratively or collectively? Do you work together in groups or coalitions to address particular problems and social issues? Because you can make change, and even political change, not just through voting or participating in the traditional political process. A lot of social change happens because enough people got together and did enough agitating and enough aggravating and enough annoying political figures to make them do something when they felt like they couldn't get the traditional voting apparatus to do that for them. So when I talk about the Black radical tradition today, I'm talking about it from this perspective of democracy from below, social movements, ground level stuff. So to define what this tradition is, it's essentially a collection of intellectual, action labor, and cultural labor that's done with the goal of fighting against cultural, social, political norms that are rooted in anti-slavery and anti-colonial efforts. So you may think about it as being something that's housed only within the American context, but when we throw in the terms anti-slavery, anti-colonial, that also puts it in a world context because those things were global systems. Slavery was a global system. So these different traditions or collections of labor are all connected by the same general goal and same kind of framework of purpose. So this starts all the way back from the beginning of the people don't like to start the history with the transatlantic slave trade because people's history existed before that particular point. So we want to say that these traditions are rooted in African cultural customs because people brought their cultural customs with them across the seas. They didn't just forget stuff, they brought it with them because they needed to maintain these cultural traditions, these cultural and social norms and traditions in order to survive. So something that's important to realize and that doesn't get talked about enough is that people resisted from the very beginning. Slavery didn't just happen to people and it just happened and nobody did anything. There were always revolts. There was always resistance. People got on the ship and started revolting. Some ships never even made it because people who were being taken to the Americas to be enslaved said no, and they banded together and they would basically overtake the crew and either the ship would crash or they would land on some random island and then that would just be it. So sometimes you don't even really hear about revolts because they worked. Sometimes you don't hear about people escaping because they escaped. Sometimes you don't hear about these things because people actually succeeded. And sometimes people don't want you to know how people succeed in upending or counteracting the system. Because if you have more people who know how to do that, then the system isn't going to be able to hold up as much because these systems are never perfect. And that's kind of the myth of all of them, is that these are perfect, all-powerful, all-encompassing systems. I mean, look at who people elect to office. The system clearly isn't perfect. So there's always like a way to kind of like find cracks in the system and to resist in whatever ways you can. So you have, people were voting on ships. Ships don't even make it to shore. Then when they get to shore, people still revolt. People revolt when they get on the plantations and are being made to work. People just revolted because it's not something that people were willing to accept. So, but then, and the most successful revolt was in Haiti. So they actually got rid of the French colonial system. During the revolution, they got all of them out of there, and then they took over Haiti. And something that's interesting about that idea is that that's another revolution that you never really hear about, because it's the first country that actually got rid of their colonizers through their own efforts of revolution. And so they were the first like black republic to emerge out of this system in the Western Hemisphere. And also because of that, it put them in hot water with the rest of the Western colonial powers. So you have a bad example of these people who got rid of the people who were the colonizers. So nobody wants to know about vote. So we don't want anyone being copycats. We don't want anyone seeing this example and thinking, oh, there's an idea. We could just kick them out and then just start over. So you don't really hear about the Haitian Revolution a lot in world history, which I think you need to hear more about, like the revolutions that worked, but also how some of them don't work and how anti or undemocratic practices seep in everywhere and tend to mess up things. So a lot of the times when you hear about different social movements that had their rise and fall, the rise typically happens when people are starting to come together and establish that collectivist culture within their organization or within their movement. The problems start to happen when people start fighting over power, and you start to see people wanting to be leaders instead of people wanting to work together for a particular goal. And then you even have Maroon societies. So these are societies in which people escaped from plantations or other places of servitude and just essentially went off of the grid. So like these are small communities that people went to when they escaped and banded together. And an interesting part about this is that Maroon communities weren't even just only escaped former enslaved Africans. They also included white people, Indigenous people. So these Maroon societies also became multicultural too, because these were all people who were trying to escape these systems of subjugation, who wanted to have a more, I guess, democratic living environment instead of being under someone's boot. So then you have the abolition efforts, all the work that's being done. So Ida B. Wells and her investigative reporting on the lynching of black men in America. You have Frederick Douglass and all of his lectures and speeches and writings about abolition. Then going into the Civil War, going past Civil War, once slavery was abolished, you had people who kind of switched where they wanted to go. So black people became citizens. So now it's making sure that black people had civil rights that were actually attended to and followed. So you had another level of intellectual and action labor that went towards these new goals. So you had people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who was trying to get black people to go to school, because at the end of the Civil War in 1865, only 28 black people had college degrees in the United States. So imagine trying to essentially educate an entire population of people when you have less than 30 in a whole country who have a college education. And there's no systems in place to educate them because they weren't even considered people up until a certain point. So how all this work comes from the grassroots level, because there weren't these higher level government or institutional factors that enabled these things to happen for people through the traditional means, because they weren't allowed that access. So what happens when people aren't allowed access to official democracy? They have to figure out how to do democracy from below. So you have to do all this labor. So you have the civil rights movement, you have the Black Power movements, and all the different iterations of those. And a lot of times when we think about the civil rights movement, we get these sanitized, whitewashed versions of them. So everybody loves to throw out the MLK quotes at you, but they never throw out the quotes where he's explicitly calling out the type of people who throw those quotes at you. In the letter to Birmingham jail, he doesn't say that the people who are conservatives or the bigots are the biggest problem. He says that the people who are the moderates are actually the worst problem, because you kind of know what to expect when someone was going to just straight up say they hate you or call you the N-word or something like that. It's a different thing altogether when you're dealing with someone who's consistently telling you, wait, it's not your turn. You have to be peaceful, when peace really only means shut up and stop complaining about what systems are messing you up. Then Then, but the Black Power movement and how the Black Panthers are another group that have been typically misrepresented in the media because of, they went way more to the left or were more radical than the Civil Rights movement in a lot of ways, which also kind of discounts the fact that MLK became more radical as the years went on. So everybody talks about MLK pre-1963 and this "I Have a Dream" speech, but they don't talk about post that era when he starts having doubts about whether or not this integration thing is working out. He said to one of his confidants, "I fear I'm integrating my people into a burning house." But nobody ever says those things. They only want to present a particular version of MLK that's like, "Oh, I have a dream. Let's all get together or live in a quote unquote colorblind society," in which that's not what he was talking about when he said, I have a dream that my children are not judged by the color of their skin, by the content of their character. That's totally taken the quote out of context, because he's saying that quote in a context in which you could get thrown in jail for just walking on the same sidewalk as a white person and not getting off of the sidewalk. Like those were actual laws that were passed in these states. Small things like that you could go to jail for. And these things are what you find out when you read about, like, in this Black radical tradition from these perspectives of marginalized individuals, because when you have this knowledge, you get to see a different perspective of power and power dynamics than if you're looking from above and looking down. Because sometimes those who don't have power in the ways that are traditionally accepted see how that power structure works in a much different way than those who are actually integrated within it. Sometimes you have a better vantage point when you're when you're on the margins and you can see the whole thing as an outsider. So, and then this is going on to even today with like Black Lives Matter movement. So all of these aren't isolated movements or isolated like bubbles or events. They are all taking place within the same general, long-standing, centuries-long tradition of work. So when someone says, "Oh, why are people just now talking about Black Lives Matter?" That's not true. People have been saying it for 400 years. They just have said it in different ways. And now we're at the age where you can make it a hashtag. So, did I go over?
Right on time.
Okay.